All right, yeah, so as I was saying, the QR code here is my link tree. You can connect with me, get all the access to all my socials accounts. I'm currently at a company called OutSystems, and previously I also worked primarily in open source developer tools at companies like Ionic, Replay, and Cypress. So love to geek out about anything web, mobile, or testing related. And we'll typically write blog posts and, make very opinionated posts about things like that. How many of you are familiar with OutSystems? Great, perfect. Then I'm talking to the right people. So I also was not familiar with OutSystems. I joined via acquisition about a year ago. I was previously at a company called Ionic. And so OutSystems is actually the #1 low-code platform. It is primarily used by enterprises that need to build a lot of apps very quickly at scale. However, it's designed for developers. So it's used by software developers, not by business users. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means as we go into the low-code ecosystem. I am on their developer relations team, so that means I work to support our community of over 800,000 developers globally, and also to help people get started with low-code and learn more about it. I come from a traditional software development background, primarily with full-stack JavaScript, also a little bit of C#.NET, as little as I can get, basically. So let's start by talking about the low-code that you do know or that you may be familiar with. The low-code tools have actually been around for a very long time, and they've had a lot of progression, starting with early visual programming. This was in the 70s and 80s with tools called computer-aided software engineering tools, or CASE tools. This is where you essentially would be able to use any kind of computer in order to build software versus hand coding it. And a lot of these are visual, like workflow tools. If you've seen flowcharts, anything related to that, those actually started very early. Then we get into visual web design tools. And these are primarily used for things that are building out the UI of a website. You're not looking too much at the data or the back end, but it's the visual front end for static websites. How many of you have used Dreamweaver before, back in the day? Yes, me too. Dreamweaver, also website builders like Squarespace, Wix. There's quite a few of those out there. You can kind of pick your poison with that one. And then we get into CMS platforms. So this is the progression where we started to add a back end of content and data to a website, but still using a low-code or visual method in order to interact with that data. So CMS platforms, obviously the big one is WordPress, Drupal. This is where we start to be able to leverage an existing content library and then feed that into a front end, again, with the use of drag and drop widgets and visual editing tools. From there, we start to actually implement low-code more on the back end with database application builders. These are things like Airtable and Caspio. Who here has used Airtable? Right, so I will say primarily when I ask somebody, have you used a low-code tool before? The top answers I get are a website builder, a CMS like WordPress, or Airtable. Airtable is by far one of the most popular answers that I get because it is designed to interact with the database in a visual way without any code, and then be able to quickly interact with that data using a UI. So that has been the next progression now that we had this visual paradigm of how to interact with data and progressing to kind of more like spreadsheet UIs for data. Then we get into workflow automation and business process management. So these are tools like Appian and Kissflow. Who here has used any tools like this? So this is where we get more into the logic and using low-code or a visual application environment in order to manipulate and design logical structures. So if this, then that. If this happens, we need to do this, this, and that. Please check for condition here, and then implement something else. So this is where you'll see things that are like flowcharts. And these can also be things that are just automated processes. Like if you receive a customer support email to your inbox, we're going to pull up their information. We're going to automatically send them a reply. We're going to assign that to a specific person. These are what we mean by workflow automation and business process management tools. And these are designed to be used by business users, right? So people who understand the processes but don't necessarily need to know how to code in order to automate these. And then we get to integration platform as a service. These are things like Zapier and MuleSoft. So it's taking those workflow automations and business processes and allowing you to integrate with external tools to continue to build these out. So now we're in the area of actually making sure that all of these independent tools can talk to each other and coordinate in order to execute those automations. And that's where we use things like Zapier and MuleSoft. So we've talked about all the different implementations and the progression of low code, starting from computer-aided software design, then we get into the front end, then we get more into the data, and then we actually got to the logic layer, integrating with other tools in order to automate processes. So all of these are typically individual tools that work together based on your use case. There's also what's called general purpose low code platforms. And this is kind of the Swiss Army knife of low code and a choose your own adventure tool because they're used for multiple development use cases. They're typically used for app development and delivery. So that's where you'll combine a website builder, the data layer, as well as logic, and then also used for workflow automation and business process management. You can also use them to integrate all those existing tools. So these are targeted to a variety of different types of users. They can be targeted to citizen developers, which are non-technical people who need to be able to build out applications for business purposes. So this is for example, an HR manager who needs an app in order to coordinate their employees' vacations and time off. They may need to really be able to quickly build out for that use case and not need to know how to code. That is what we call a citizen developer. Enterprise developers are people who typically come from a coding background, but want to be able to move more quickly. And so these are what we call enterprise developers who are leveraging low-code platforms in order to accelerate development. And this typically will be used for internal apps, external apps, or both. So who here has used Microsoft Power Apps before or is familiar with Power Apps at all? A few people. Okay, so Microsoft Power Apps is designed specifically to build out internal applications for your organization. So it's really embedded into the Microsoft ecosystem, so you can leverage any data that you have coming to and from other Microsoft applications and build out UIs very quickly and interact with that data. So that's an example of a use case for internal apps. Other times you can use low-code platforms to build externally, which means it's going to be for actual business users or your customers, anybody who's not in your organization. And that's where you'll have to you have to incorporate more security measures and things that are outside of your ecosystem for authentication. So again, some of the examples of a general purpose low-code platform is OutSystems, Mendix, and Power Apps. However, we are seeing increasingly more of these general purpose low-code platforms. And there's some more examples would be things like Retool, AppSmith, and typically those are designed for developers building external applications and using a mix of code and low code. Because again, this is low code, right? It's not no code. And we're going to talk a little bit about what those differences are. But why would you want to reach for low code, especially if you already know how to code? Well, the biggest one is obviously speed, right? If you think about people who've used Dreamweaver or used WordPress, if you needed to build out a blog site and you could use a headless CMS, you could quickly build out a UI, you could design some components. But if you needed to execute that same thing in WordPress using the pre-existing template or pre-existing widgets, it would just be a lot faster. You may not love the result, and you may spend more time trying to make it work to your specifications, but you do get that speed of being able to build up something for common use cases very quickly. There's also the cost of development. Typically, you're able to, because you're spending less time, it is less expensive to build out applications. And you also get predictability. You're using pre-built components, widgets, different paradigms that have been used before over and over again. And so you typically know how they're going to behave. You don't have to build that logic out from scratch. Because of this, you also have built-in development, performance, accessibility, design, and security, and other best practices. So for example, typically all of the components for a low-code platform will be accessible by design. It's already built in. You don't have to then go and figure out how to implement accessible components. Same thing with performance. They're used by millions and millions of people, so they need to be performant, and that is built into the platform itself by design. You typically also have cross-platform capabilities. What that means is that you can build for web and mobile and then also for APIs using the same platform, and you don't have to have different projects for different platforms. We're also seeing a lot of acceleration with AI in combination with low code. And so what that means is that we're seeing a lot more integrations. I mean, we're seeing a lot of integrations with AI and high code as well. But what we're finding is that the combination of low code and AI together is an accelerator because of the fact that you're using pre-built widgets and components versus generating code. And we'll talk a little bit more about app gen versus code gen with AI and what the differences are there. Another thing is popularity. It's really growing in popularity. There was a Gartner survey that found that 87% of enterprise organizations are leveraging low code in some way. And so you're seeing this increasingly across different business units, and it can be important to understand why that is and be able to find talent who can interact with low code. And this is just an example of the popularity is growing in terms of salary as well. So OutSystems developer in red is right alongside some of the other salaries in terms of full stack development, backend developer, as well as front end developers. Mobile developers are high and above the rest of the pack, as typically is expected for native mobile development. There's also a low-code economic impact. I won't go too much into this, but the link is on the slide to the report. But this talks about the economic savings of implementing low-code in an organization. But it's not for everything. Things like web and mobile applications, customer portals, if you're modernizing legacy systems or building out apps quickly, those are really good use cases for low-code. Anything that is going to be very custom use cases like gaming, video manipulation, animations. If you're a product company that is building a single SaaS product and you need a lot of customization, that's not a great use case for low code, right? And so it's like a tool, it has a fit for certain things, not for everything. I mentioned that we would talk about no code versus low code very briefly. So we are talking here about low code, which means that there is some code. You do interact with code for customization, and you also need to leverage software development practices and concepts. So no code is purely visual development, and it's suited for non-technical individuals, or what we call citizen developers. It's good for common use cases, and it has limited customization. This is starting to change. We are seeing some no-code platforms that have more customization options, which is great. One example is Bubble, a no-code platform that allows you to change up a lot of the templates in the UIs so they don't have that kind of cookie-cutter feel. But typically, you're not going to have as many options with no code as you would with low code. And again, low code is still visual development, but it has customization. It's suited for more technical individuals because you will need to interact with code and you'll need to implement software architecture practices like understanding what a UI, logic, and data layer are. It's meant to accelerate development, not replace it. And it's also good for custom use cases where scalability is required. It typically allows you to access or edit underlying code depending on what platform that you're using. So this means that you can either interact with the output code or interact with it via a platform. So if you're looking for a no-code solution, this is typically small and medium-sized companies, startups, non-technical departments, like I said, those HR departments, marketing departments, entrepreneurs, and then education and training institutions will also leverage no-code a lot to build out courses and training materials. This is the G2 grid for no-code development platforms. And again, in the slides, there's a link to this report that shows the ecosystem. As you can see, there are quite a few. A lot of them are still in the early stages of development and more specifically for niche use cases. There aren't as many general purpose no-code platforms because, again, they're designed for very common specific things with little customization. So we're going to talk about maybe the low code that you may not know as much about, and this is really what we think about when we think about the future of low code and where low code is heading. So away from the individual use cases at different layers of the software development lifecycle, but more of full stack low code. So using low code to build across the entire stack in one tool versus independently creating out the front end, the logic and the data, and then connecting them. We're also going to talk about cloud native low code, which is increasing in popularity along with the increased popularity of cloud native. And as I mentioned, the accelerating benefits of using AI in combination with low code for app gen. Any questions so far on the low code ecosystem before we dig into more of the full stack low code? Okay, great. So when I talk about full stack low code, what that means is you have full stack across the UI, the logic, and the data layer for application development within a single platform. Again, these are platforms like Mendix, Power Apps, and OutSystems, where you are manipulating each of these in one IDE, a visual integrated development environment. It also means being able to integrate and extend via things like APIs, integration connectors, and connecting to enterprise systems and databases. This is helpful in organizations where you may have dozens of legacy systems, where you have a variety of different tools that you have to use in order to build on top of them. With the integration capabilities, you can combine these different data sources and build quickly for UIs. We're also talking about full lifecycle, so not just full stack in terms of the development process, but full lifecycle across the SDLC for things like DevOps, including your deployments, your testing, your monitoring, and your analysis of performance and everything while it's out in production. And I mentioned one of the benefits of using low code is that it's typically a cross-platform solution. So you have web, mobile, API web services, and then also chat, voice, SMS, and email experiences that you're building out. On the full stack development side, I'm not gonna show the videos because I'll actually dig into an actual demo later on. But this is an example of the visual IDE where everything is done via drag and drop and it's a visual environment versus actually typing out code. Now, again, this is something where it is a bit of a learning curve if you've not used the visual development environment before. I think of it as a visual like VS Code, but instead of typing, you're dragging and dropping and you're clicking. And so this is something where you're able to, it kind of reinforces you to use certain workflows and best practices versus coding things out from scratch. Same thing with the life cycle, so you can manage deployments. Everything is done via a UI versus doing infrastructure as code or building out pipelines. Again, this is something where it's all integrated together. And as I mentioned, the experiences. So again, it's low code, it's not no code. So that means that you can extend this with traditional code. So under the hood, what OutSystems does is once you edit everything in the IDE, it generates a React app on the front end, it generates a .NET app in the logic layer, and then it's all SQL, a SQL database in the back end. That means that you can upload libraries using .NET and augment those in your code. What that looks like is whatever library you import, the same way that you would import like an NPM package in your project, you instead upload that file and then it becomes a node that you can then use within your application. So you can call that code, you can interact with it from your visual logic flows. This is helpful if you have very specific use cases or if you have existing libraries that implement certain things at your organization, and you can augment that with code. You can also augment with JavaScript in the front end because, again, it's a React application. So there's a JavaScript node where you can implement custom code. This can be helpful for interacting with libraries where it's not a direct connection. So, for example, if you wanted to use TensorFlow to train a model on your front end of your application and you needed to be able to call that API, you could use JavaScript node in order to interact with that library using custom JavaScript code, and then use your dependencies to make sure that that library is imported in your HTML for your application and augment everything that happens in the platform. And you don't have to wait for, oh, we built a TensorFlow connector, or we built this kind of integration that you can use visually. At any time, if something brand new comes out that you want to be able to implement into your app, you can do that with custom JavaScript. And again, that's one of the differentiators between no code and low code. That being said, you have to understand how to implement that custom JavaScript, which is why low code does require a technical understanding of how software is built. Because I kind of think of JavaScript it being, for example, it's a dynamically typed language versus statically typed languages, and how JavaScript will run a lot of things that maybe it shouldn't. And so with great kind of flexibility comes responsibility to ensure that you're still building out things in a performant way. And low code helps to emphasize, to enforce those best practices. I mentioned you can also extend with connectors. So these are kind of pre-built connectors that if you don't want to have to interact with an API or build that out customly, there's a variety of providers that you can interact with. Typically, they are enterprise type systems like Oracle databases, Salesforce, SAP. And then we actually also have an open source component library. Many low-code platforms actually do have open source, which I did not realize because I figured you had to have code for it to be open source, but Mendix, OutSystems all have open source components that are built by the community and maintained by community that you can implement into your applications. So that's full stack low code. And again, we'll dig into an example here before we get into the cloud native. So this is ODC Studio, which is the app development in IDE for building out a full stack application with OutSystems. This experience is very similar in Power Apps. It's very similar in Mendix as well. And really, it's like I said, it's just like kind of a visual VS Code in terms of you're building a new app, build a phone app. There is a variety of templates and things for common use cases, but you can do this also with by customizing it and building it from scratch. And so this is our IDE. We can see we have an interface layer, we have a logic layer, and we have a data layer. And we also have events, things that we can use for event-driven architecture. Some of these things will look familiar. We have some widgets on the left-hand side. It's going to look similar if you use any other kind of drag-and-drop interface. At the data layer, we have a database. We can actually import from Excel in order to kind of get things started. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, just bootstrap using some Excel data. You can also add tables. Essentially, this is a table. I just created a task table. We're doing a to-do app because that is, everyone does a to-do app for their demos. But here we can see we have a task table. We call it entities. But it has an ID, it has a description, it has a due date, and it has an is-active Boolean. And all of these have data types. And so that's where you need to be able to understand software concepts like data. And they also have automatically created CRUD operations for interacting with this table. So we have create, creator update, and then delete. What we can then do is actually drag this task onto the UI, and it will use AI in order to build screens out based on our data model. The most common use cases for interacting with data is viewing the data and then editing or adding new data. And so that's what it creates by default. You can also customize this. But what that looks like is our task list now has a UI that lists out the data. So it's just viewing the table of data. And then we also have a screen that is used for interacting with the data, which I'll pull up here and say, get this cord going. All right, so again, this is the screen for viewing the data, and this is the screen for interacting with the data. You can set each screen to be accessible. I'm gonna go ahead and set this to everyone just so we can interact with it. And then you publish it. And while that's publishing, I'll show, like on the left-hand side, you see widgets. These are gonna be very similar to any other drag and drop that you've seen, things like lists, inputs. You also may see things like if statements, and those are to account for whether or not something should be shown. So if, for example, like in View, you have vShow, where you show a component only if something is true, and you can interact with your data that way. On our tasks page, we have a get tasks query that's just pulling the list of tasks from our database, as well as a get task by ID for our individual detail screen. We also have these kind of logic flows, which show the visual nature of building out logic. So it checks if the form is valid. If it's not, then it gives a warning. If it does, then it calls our task creator update method on our server and then directs back to our screen. So we can open this in the browser and we can kind of get a preview here. Because I set this as a mobile app, you could also give you a QR code in order to be able to interact with it as a PWA. And we're able to change the devices and see what it looks like on different types of devices. We're also able to create an IPA or an Android package specifically to build this out right here in the user interface. And again, this is currently in my development environment. If I wanted to move this to production, I could do that all in the UI. So that's an example very, very quickly, obviously, of building out a quick screen, just to kind of show a little bit more about what's going on with our data. Let's say that we wanted to also add a new attribute to this entity. So not just that if it's complete, but is important. This is something that's an important task. We automatically inferred the data type as a Boolean based on the name of it. So because we have that is important, it figures, hey, this is probably a Boolean, and it automatically infers that. We can then use this that data now on the front end. So if we go to back to our task screen, And we say, hey, I want to show a exclamation icon if it's an important task. So we can kind of drag this over. If you've used Bootstrap before, you'll see that it has the column layouts, which is very similar to Bootstrap. And we can say we want to add an icon here. And we want to do an exclamation icon. We don't want it to be too big. So we'll make that regular font size, and we'll make it the same color as our theme. So we'll do like a red color if it's important. But we want to only show this if there is, if it's actually important. So we can actually select this icon, and we can enclose it in an if. So again, we're using logic here. And you can see right away that an error popped up. And so what that does is it tells me that something is missing or something is wrong, and it won't let me publish until that error is resolved. So what the error is on my if, I don't have anything applied to check that condition. And if I select the condition, it'll automatically recommend this is important value, and then that resolves it. So if the task is important, it will show this icon. If it doesn't, then it will show nothing. So we can go ahead and publish this again. But the problem is we actually can't update this yet. So we can see if something is important, but there's no way for us to mark it important. So we can do that on our task detail screen. And our detail screen allows us to edit or add new information. We can see here we have an is active checkbox, but we don't have an is complete, is important checkbox. So we'll do the same thing. We'll add another container here. We'll go ahead and put a label in that container. And we will label that as, is important. And then we'll go ahead and add a checkbox as well, the same way that we have for our other is active underneath. Oh yeah, let me go ahead and add another container here. And everything here correlates to divs, HTML. Again, this is building out React underneath. So we have our label, we have our container, and then we're going to put the checkbox here. And when I add this checkbox, it's going to, again, give me another error because it needs to correspond to a value, and we're just going to do the is important again. And then I'm going to move that down here. I'm not going to move this over a little bit. And we have our checkbox. I'll go ahead and publish that. I'm not going to worry about fixing that right now with the trackpad. It's a little tricky. And then we'll be able to then update that data and change it on the interface. And so again, this is all being deployed via our UI. We're able to test this on a device right away. And that's just an example of how you're manipulating data, logic, and then also the UI in a single platform. Any questions on this part, on the IDE? And again, as I mentioned, so it's been updated to the latest version. We can now click in, we can change to is important. We can save that, go back, and now we have our exclamation. So again, this is all customizable. A lot of people actually use custom CSS and custom components, but just to give you a quick idea and interaction of what that looks like. All right, so let's talk about cloud native low code. This is another area where we're seeing more low code platforms move into. OutSystems Developer Cloud is a cloud-native low-code platform that is built on top of Linux containers with Kubernetes, which allows it for auto-scale on demand. It allows for separation between the different environments, as well as using EKS under the hood for high availability regions, auto-scaling, and ensuring that the application can scale vertically. This is the architecture, what that looks like. I won't go too much into that. The slides, again, are available via QR code. But this means that the portal is used in order to manage all of your authorization and authentication for your users, as well as your deployments, and also to generate native apps. And I just showed that a little bit on the portal here versus using the videos. But I also do want to show the monitoring aspect of it. So here is our portal for an environment. And this is where I was just in order to do the apps and also to build out workflows and to manage deployments here. So this is where you would promote things from development environment to production environment as well. So we have a QA and a production environments built in, but also analysis. So we have our analytics in terms of our performance, as well as logs and traces, and these are full stack traces, so on the back end, and also client-side traces, as well as code quality. So this is continual code scanning, not just for errors, but also for what we call like code smells or low code smells in this case. And so this is, for example, showing that we have an exposed REST service without authentication. That's a security code quality issue. It shows which element specifically has that problem, and it also tells you how to resolve that and what the potential impact would be. And these are all categorized as critical, high, low, and medium, and they're constantly being reviewed, and you can also implement certain automation. So for example, if something is critical, you can set up alerts for that so that your team is able to go in and resolve that quickly. All right, and then we're also talking about AI and low code, and I mentioned something earlier, a concept of app gen versus code gen. So who here has used like Copilot, Cursor, anything in order to create code using AI? Okay, well, not as many people as I thought. I use it all the time. So and so what we're seeing there is who here has experienced a hallucination with the code that it gives you? So it gives you code that does not actually exist or should not exist. So this happens to me a lot. I like to build video games with an API called Phaser. It's an open source JavaScript framework for building out games in the browser. And I would ask ChatGPT, hey, I want to change the camera view on this sprite. How do I do that? And it gives me a function, and I'm like, great. And I put that in my code, and it turns out that that API does not exist at all. Like that function is not in the docs. It doesn't have anywhere. So when we're using AI for code gen, because of hallucinations, this creates an issue where we have to constantly validate the output of AI because it's creating text, right? So it's actually creating tokens, but that token is converted into code, and we have to validate if that code should actually exist. What we're seeing with AI and the combination of low code is that instead of creating code, we're creating from a library of already existing applications, widgets, screens. So it is a check against the output of what that prompt is. So yesterday there was a talk about interacting with AI for web applications, and talked about the 4 structures of a good prompt. And one of the prompt is a condition, and also defining the output. And it says, if this doesn't exist, if the answer isn't real, don't give me an answer. And that's kind of the condition. It says, tell me this instead. The other is defining the output. So if you were able to say, I need a component that does this in view 3, give me the code for that. However, if that is not possible in view 3, do not give me an answer. Also, the output should be in this format using the composition API, and it should only use composition API functions that actually exist. Then you get a much more controlled answer in your output. And that is what AI and low code is doing together. It's saying, I want to generate a screen. However, we only have these components in OutSystems or Mendix, so you need to use one of these pre-existing widgets and components. We have these existing nodes for your logic flow. You can only use these. And then from that restrictions, then generate the app, then generate the page, then generate the component. And so by combining low code, which really is just an abstraction on top of code that restricts the code, we're able to better control the output from AI and prevent hallucinations. And that's where we get to the concept of app gen versus code gen. So you're not generating code that then turns into an app. You're one level higher of abstraction, where you're using natural language to say, build me a product catalog that uses this data source, and if there is a product that doesn't exist, it should not be shown. And use these specific component widgets that already exist from our component library. Don't use anything else. And because you're an abstraction layer higher, it's not generating tokens, it's actually making logical decisions and then applying specific applications of that to the applications that are being generated. So we have that, for example, with built into the IDE in terms of suggestions. And you're going to see that initially here on this logic flow. Whereas you're building something out, it'll say, this is what we think you should do next. And again, that is coming from specific nodes that already exist. So we won't give you a suggestion and say you should do this because it doesn't exist. You can only do things that make sense within the context of those restrictions. There's also AI Agent Builder, which allows you to build out chatbots and interact with AI models. And again, you can also use additional data sources for RAG, and this is, again, based on existing components, existing interactions, and not generating the code, but generating the actual agent application itself. I mentioned the AI-powered code reviews earlier, but then we talk about full stack app gen. So this is where you use a natural language prompt. It's called OutSystems Mentor. You can also upload a requirements documentation. But what's happening is what's being output is everything that only comes from existing OutSystems widgets. And that allows you to then be able to only use those that are already existing. OutSystems Mentor is currently in early access, so if you'd like to get more information about that, you can let me know. But this is something that we're seeing across a lot of different types of tools. Who's here has used like V0 from Vercel? Does anybody use that? So that is an example where you give a natural language prompt and then it builds out the screen for you. Now that is creating code, but it's validating that code and that it's running the code to ensure that it's actually going to create the screen that you want. And we're seeing this more and more with low-code tools, where it's validating whatever gets output from AI against these constraints, these already built-in constraints of low-code. And so I'm going to go ahead and move this past here. So there's some things that you need to take into consideration if you're evaluating what type of tool to use, whether it's low-code, whether it's no-code, whether it's a specific tool for implementing low-code. So obviously the first consideration is, what are you building? You know, if you're building apps or if you're building workflows, you may want to just use a tool that can do the one thing that you need to do versus something that's more general purpose. You also need to consider if you're building a static website or something that is dynamic, where you'll need access to the underlying data and logic, or if you're doing something like a static site where you just need to build out a UI. Also, the scalability of what you're building, as well as how much customization do you need. Again, with low code, you get more customization, but then you also have to do that customization. So it depends on what your requirements are for your organization, as well as the integrations. You know, a lot of times when you're evaluating a tool, you'll say, okay, well, we really need to connect to this. And if it doesn't do that, then it's kind of it stops right there. So that typically is a big consideration when evaluating different tools. You also think about who's building it. So the level of coding expertise on your team. So if you're using a no-code tool or a low-code tool, you need to understand what the learning curve is like. Also the community size, and then whether you're using citizen developers or enterprise developers, and whether you're going to be using external or internal developer resources to build out the application. You also need to consider who has access to other systems or data. So if it is business or citizen developers who are going to be interacting with this no-code tool, will they be able to interact with their system that they need to, or will they not have access and then need to go through an engineering team in order to make that work? These are the Gartner critical capabilities for evaluating a low-code platform. And so it's user experience design, development experience, application logic and workflow, DevOps practices, governance, integration and APIs, and platform extensibility, security, and quality service. So these are all the critical capabilities that Gartner has defined when evaluating low-code platforms, and this can be a good checklist as you're going through and determining what type of tool may be best for your projects. And this is the G2 grid for low-code development platforms. And so you may see that it looks a little bit different than the no-code G2 grid, in that there are more on the top of the screen, meaning that there are more that are used for general purpose type applications. So on the you still see more on the bottom, but there are more than no code. And that's because of the customization aspect of low code, that it's not going to be as specifically for niche, but it's going to be more for general type applications. And again, this links out to the actual report from the slides. So to recap, we talked about the progression of low-code tools and also why you may reach for low-code specifically. We also talked about the future of low-code, the things like full-stack low-code, cloud-native low-code, and AI plus low-code. And then we also went through the different considerations that you want to think about when you're evaluating whether you should use low-code or no-code tools. And when I speak about that, I mostly talked about this from the perspective of an organization deciding, I want to use this tool for a project. But you can also think about this from a developer perspective. So a lot of our OutSystems developers in our community, the people that I work with, they came from traditional coding backgrounds. So a lot of them are C#, .NET developers who then became an OutSystems developer. And an OutSystems developer is a title that you can have. It's just like being a React developer or an Angular developer or a .NET developer. And many developers have decided to move in that direction for their career because they are more focused on output and outcomes versus the craft of coding. And people who are really interested in the craft of coding may not find that as satisfying. So it really depends too, as you're evaluating whether as a developer, what types of tools that you want to interact with. Do you want to go with something that is becoming more popular, that is more focused for enterprises? Do you want something that is more specialized, that you can have a wider variety of customizations? These are also considerations that you can think about from your own personal developer perspective. So this is a QR code if you are interested in checking out the OutSystems platform. This gives you access to our cloud native environment. We have free training courses, we have certifications. So if, as a developer, if you are curious about learning more about what it's like to build out completely full stack with low code, you can access this QR code. Is also in the slides. And this is the link to the slides and the QR code as well. So yeah, I'm happy to answer it. If anybody has any questions, feel free to come up and say hi if you don't want to shout them out. But hopefully this was helpful for you. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to get out from the light. It's just very bright up here, so I can't see you. Okay.
So are you able to kind of dynamically, earlier you were able to show like some of the fields based on whether or not they were in your are you able to do required field or disabled?
Yes, that's a really good question. So the question was, can you also mark things as like required or disabled? And a lot of the widgets will actually have that as a built-in property. So it'll say it'll say disabled, and then you can choose which value you want that to correlate to. The same way you can with, I use Vue, so that's why I keep talking about Vue. But I mentioned like the Vue vShow component or attribute. And so that will actually show up as a property in the UI. And you can say, show if this is true, and it'll say disabled if this is true. So if, for example, if the person is not authenticated, then only an admin can actually update the task. So if they're not an admin, you can make it where it's disabled. And then it'll even show, okay, and you can select that from the dropdown of like user.isauthenticated. And because all of your users are managed within the platform, that's built in. So you don't have to like call like an Auth0 API or figure out what that is. It's all just it's a visual dropdown that says like user.isauthenticated, and then it would be disabled if they're not. And so all of those properties, a lot of them are built into the widgets, and then you can customize anything specifically if it doesn't fit what you need by using a concept called blocks, which I didn't go into because of the time. But we call them blocks, and really that's just a custom component. And so you build it out, you add whatever properties, you have inputs, the same way you have props, then you have internal logic on the component, and so you can take that prop in and then use that within the component. And then you essentially create that, so you could say like, my employee details component, and it's just like a little block. And then you can import that anywhere in your application, any kind of screen, and you can use that. So if there's anything that's custom beyond what the widgets offer, if you need additional properties, you can create a custom block. The same way you would create a custom component in like Vue or React. Cool. Any other questions? Yeah, awesome. All right, thank you so much.